Hey, Jonathan here from Orange Turbine, and in this video, I'm excited to announce that Retopoflow 4 is now in beta. This means a couple things. First is that the tools should be stable and ready for general use. You may still find a bug here or there, but we've been testing this for months and lots of people have been taking a look at it in the alpha and reporting issues and whatnot, so things at this point should be quite stable. The design of the tools is more solidified, and we think it's ready for everyday use. The switch to beta also means that it's available for purchase on Superhive, formerly the Blender Market, and if you purchase it while it's in beta, then you're getting it for roughly $25 off. If you'd like to test it out for free, then you can also go to orangeturbine.com/beta-tester, sign up for our email list, and we'll send you the beta builds for free when new ones are ready for testing. If you're upgrading from version 3, there's also a coupon code that you can use, Retopoflow-OG, for an additional 25% off on top of the beta price. Also, if you have version 3 and you want to stick with it, either to use it with an older Blender version or you just want to get the most out of your purchase, don't worry, we will be supporting it for another 2 years after Retopoflow 4 officially launches. So it'll still work with new Blender versions and we'll still do bug fixes and things like that. It just won't be getting any new features, as the new features will now be coming to version 4. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is that the documentation has been completely rewritten for Retopoflow 4. So if you go to docs.retopoflow.com, then you can read all about how this version is working and how all of the tools work and the different hotkeys and things like that. And the documentation in this version is much more descriptive, and so you should learn quite a bit just by scrolling through the different tool sections. But in this video, I want to introduce you to Retopoflow 4. So right off the bat, you can install it just like any other extension. Just go to your preferences, go to add-ons, and go to the dropdown, and choose Install from Disk. Then when Retopoflow 4 pops up, go ahead and enable that, and you'll be ready to go. If you're used to working with Retopoflow 3, then you might notice that there's no longer a menu up in the 3D view header, and that's because Retopoflow 4 doesn't need a separate mode. Everything is just in edit mode. So if we take our cube here and hit tab to go into edit mode, then you'll see that we have down here a bunch of different Retopoflow specific tools. And entering Retopoflow mode is just switching to any of these tools. So you can see as I switch in and out of PolyPen here, a few different things change in the 3D viewport. When you enter a Retopoflow tool, it automatically sets up a bunch of things for retopology. It sets up the selection mode, it sets up the retopology overlay, it sets up the snapping, and you can turn these things on or off in preferences. So if you don't want switching to the tools to change anything, then you can go to tool switching and turn these things on or off. But of course, after you exit the tool, then it'll switch back to whatever you had previously. So all of your previous settings for all of these things are still saved. It's just automatically managed when you're in these tools. Now, let's say you switch to PolyPen, and in this case, we're not really going to be able to do anything. Of course, we can select, but we can't really move our vertices around by clicking and dragging, and we can't create new geometry. And that's because we have nothing in the scene to snap to. Just like in Retopoflow 3, Retopoflow 4 depends on snapping to an object, because that's kind of the goal of retopology. So let's go back to object mode here, and we could create a new object with mesh plane. I'll move that up, tab into edit mode, and we can get to work this way. You can see now I can click and drag on my vertices to tweak them, and I can also create new geometry just by deselecting everything, holding down Control, and left clicking. But before we get too far in this, I also want to show you a faster way to get started. So I'll go ahead and delete that plane, and then with the cube, I'll just hit Shift-A, Mesh, and Retopology at Cursor, or you could choose Retopology at Active. In this case, the cursor is at the center of the active object already, and the cube has no local rotation, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick. But we could choose Retopology at Active, and that's just going to add a new mesh object that's completely empty, and it'll name it Cube Retopology. So that's how you jump right into a new retopology project, and we can start drawing on the mesh. Like I mentioned before, to create new geometry using PolyPen, you hold down Control. So hold down Control and left click, and that's going to place a new vertex. And with that vertex still selected, hold down Control, click again, and that's going to place an edge. Do that one more time, that'll make a triangle, and do that again, that'll make a quad. So what PolyPen creates depends on what it is that you have selected. So if I select an edge here, and notice that I can just click in the middle of the edge and select both of those vertices, that's because PolyPen switches automatically to both vertex and edge select mode. You can turn that off or on with the hotkeys by 1, 2, 3 on the top row of the number keys and only select vertices. You can do that, but you can also shift select any of these to also select, let's say, edge select mode, and that way I can just easily work with both edges and vertices. But let's say we have an edge selected, I can hold down Control and just start drawing out. And so this way, I can work very quickly and draw out new geometry. Now we have a few different options for when we're working in PolyPen. If you'd like, you can also set this to quad in the method, which, by the way, all of the tool settings are in the tool header. You can also find them in the sidebar under Tool, or in the Properties editor under the Tool tab. If the method is set to quad, then as soon as you have an edge selected, then you can just draw out quads like so. You can also set this to draw only triangles, or only edges, or only vertices, though this tri-quad option is my favorite because it allows me to be really specific about all 4 corners of the quad that I'm creating. You can also really easily bridge things in PolyPen. So for example, if you have an edge selected and you hold down Control and just hover over any other edge, then it'll bridge right to it. To tweak vertices, just left click and drag on them. And Retopoflow tools automatically have merge doubles enabled. So if you drag a vertex on top of another vertex, then you'll see it snap right to it and it'll get merged. There's not a whole lot else to talk about when it comes to PolyPen. It's pretty simple, but also it's going to be one of the tools that you use the most because it allows you to be incredibly specific and place points quickly exactly where you need them. To look at the other tools, I'll go ahead and just delete the cube and the existing retopology, and let's look at an object that's a bit more interesting. Here we have this bear statue, and again, I'll hit Shift-A, Mesh, and Retopology at Cursor. You can see I don't have an active object, so this one is grayed out, but we can start a new retopology at the cursor and start drawing right away. The next tool we'll look at is PolyStrips, and this one allows you to draw out strips of quads and manipulate them like a Bezier curve. So for example, if I wanted to outline this neck here, I could just hold down Control and left click and drag. That's going to create a strip of quads, which has these control points that I can move around and adjust. So I can adjust the control points, or I can adjust the handles to manipulate the curve. The size of the quads that you create are going to be based on the brush size. So you can either change the brush radius up in the tool settings, or you can use the hotkey F and change this just like any other brush in Blender. So use a really small brush size to get small quads, and use a big brush size to get big quads. There are a couple really cool things about PolyStrips. One is that you can attach and connect to any existing face. So if I hold down Control and start my stroke from any face, and I can just drag outwards, and it'll automatically connect there. That also works going to any face, so I can drag from one to the other and connect it like so. Another thing that you can do is, after you've created a strip, you can hold down Control and scroll up or down on the mouse wheel to change the number of cuts. You can also hold down Shift and scroll up or down to change the width. The last control that you'll see in the redo panel in the bottom left is split angle, and this is how sharp you need to draw in order for it to be considered a sharp corner. So let's say I draw a 90-degree angle just like so. Then you'll see that it actually inputs that as a sharp corner, and I can change this split angle. So if I change that to be above around 100 degrees or so, then that gets turned into a smooth corner, which in this case doesn't look very good because that was a pretty sharp angle that I drew. But if it was less extreme, something like that, then that's when it's useful to be able to control whether or not that's considered a corner. Another really great feature of PolyStrips is that it works with proportional editing. So let's say that we have, a bunch of geometry already kind of worked out here, and we wanted to adjust an existing strip. Let's go ahead and use PolyPen just to fill this in a little bit more. I'll fill in this area. And also, I forgot to mention while we were working with PolyPen, but it can also be used as a basic knife. So if I hold down Control and just click over an edge, then I can input cuts like this, just like so. And then I can fill in these areas pretty easily. One really great thing about Retopoflow 4 is that it works with all of the regular Blender edit mode hotkeys. So for example, if I want to make these into quads, I can rip this edge with V, and I'll do the same thing here. Rip with V, and then I can select this edge at the back, double tap F, just like the regular Blender hotkey, and it'll fill that right in. I'll do the same thing here, create an extra cut, select this edge, double tap F, and I am filled. But the whole point of adding that extra geometry for this example is so that I can go to PolyStrips. That's going to jump us into face select mode. And let's say I want to adjust the strip along the neck. Well, I can select one face and then Control Shift left click to select the shortest path in between those two. And I can adjust existing geometry like a Bezier curve as well. Though if I move this around, you can see it's only affecting the selected strip. But if I turn on proportional editing, as I move this around, and you might need to increase or decrease the effect size with the mouse wheel till it fits what you want. But now I can adjust this entire section based on this loop. And when it comes to defining the main loops of your characters, this is incredibly useful. So that's PolyStrips. But before we move on to strokes or contours, let's go ahead and look at the brushes at the bottom. The first one is the tweak brush, and that just allows us to move our vertices around by clicking and dragging. So pretty basic, but when it comes to moving lots of vertices, this is really useful so that we don't have to tweak them one by one. Again, you can change the brush size with F, just like any other brush in Blender. You can also do that in the tool settings if you'd like. You can change the strength with Shift F. If that's all the way at 1, then the vertices are going to exactly follow where the mouse is, at least the vertex in the middle. And then if this is smaller, then you're just kind of nudging things around. So I usually use a pretty high strength, but then you also have a fall off control. You can change this with Alt F. And if this is all the way out to the edges, then everything inside the brush is going to follow along here. And if this is a really small value, then you'll get a nice smooth fall off. The masking edges can be really helpful here. By default, it doesn't matter whether the geometry is selected or not, but you can set this to be only if you only want to affect the selection. Or you can set this to exclude if you want the selection to act like a mask. You can also do the same thing for the boundary. By default, I can move the boundary just fine, but you could also set that to exclude and move everything except the boundary. Or, my favorite option, you can set this to slide, and that way you can move things along the boundary and kind of slide them and manipulate your spacing while still keeping the overall shape of the boundary the same. You can also choose whether or not you want to manipulate corners or occluded geometry, which is geometry that's hiding behind other objects. Because by default, we generally don't want to move what we can't see, but in some cases, like if you have a vertex that somehow got stuck under the mesh, then you might want to turn that on temporarily. The next brush under that is Relax, and this one has all the same controls when it comes to the brush itself, but this one, when you left click, is going to nudge all of your vertices into an evenly spaced grid. So you can see that I had some pretty nasty geometry here that I created with PolyPen, but as I just left click and drag over this, that starts to look a lot better. In the algorithm options, you can control exactly how it's doing this straightening. So if you run into a situation where things aren't smoothing out exactly the way that you want, then you can go ahead and mess with these settings, but for the most part, the default should work great. So this is really useful if, for example, you have to add an edge loop here, and then realize that the geometry is now a bit too tight in this area. You can just run over it with Relax and smooth that out. Next up, let's jump back up to strokes. Strokes is one of my favorite tools and the one I use, I would say, the second most after PolyPen, and I think it's the most powerful one out of the bunch. The way that it works is similar to PolyStrips. If you hold down Control, you'll get a little brush control, and then you can left click and drag to draw on the surface. That's going to create a strip of edges, which might seem less exciting than a strip of quads, but here's the cool thing. You can then, with that strip still selected, hold down Control, and then draw a second parallel stroke, and that's going to get automatically filled in with a patch of quads. Once you've placed down a patch, then you can hold down Control and scroll up or down on the mouse wheel to change how many cuts were inserted. The default method of inserting is average, but let's go ahead and look at fixed first, which is just a fixed number. So let's say the fixed number is 8. I draw a stroke, I get 8 edges. And of course we can hold down Control, scroll up or down after the fact and change that, but that's going to be a fixed count. You can also set that to brush radius, which is going to work similar to PolyStrips, where now if I draw a stroke, each edge is going to be the length of the brush. My favorite option though, and the one that's default, is average. So if nothing is selected here, and I left click and drag, then that's going to use the brush size. But then if I were to make a stroke with something selected, then it's going to take the average length of these edges and use that to determine how many cuts to make. So that's always going to leave us with as evenly spaced quads as possible. For example, if I were to set this to fixed, and let's say I make a patch like this, let's see, that's 8, and then way over here, then that's not going to be very evenly spaced. Or if I do one really close, again, not very evenly spaced. If I set this to brush radius, then that's going to be a little bit better. But if I were to zoom in really close, make a stroke and then zoom out, then again, I'd still have to adjust things after the fact. But when this is set to average, I can zoom in, I can make my stroke, I can zoom out, I can go way over here. I can work with differently sized areas. Let's say I have a ton of verts here. I can pull that out to be evenly spaced quads. I can take this one, move that over here, and again, just by default, it's going to be evenly spaced. But the real power of strokes comes with how many different shapes you can make with the stroke. So far we've just been doing equals strips, which is just drawing two parallel lines, pretty simple. But another thing that you can do is use this to fill areas. So let's say I have a really dense patch, and I'll use a small brush size just to exaggerate this. If I were to draw a strip like that, and draw a strip like that, and then let's say that all of these vertices in the middle were deleted, something like so. And I wanted to fill this entire area. Well, what I could do is make that same type of stroke, again, just a parallel line, but I can do that across the ends from one vertex to the next and fill this entire area. So strokes can also be great for filling. And even in this case, you can use Control and scroll to adjust where that gets attached to. But that's not the only type of gesture that we can make. In Retopoflow 3, you could also take any vertex that's at the end of a selection, hold down Control, and draw outwards like so, just to extrude a section. But in Retopoflow 4, you can now do that same thing from any one of these vertices. So let's say I take this middle vertex, hold down Control, and just extrude it outwards. So I can do that from any selection here. So that's also a really intuitive way of creating more geometry. This is called a T-strip because we're creating a bit of a T shape when combined with the selection. And we have a couple different extrapolation modes when it comes to creating these T-strips. The default is set to flat, which is just going to extrude everything straight. But in Retopoflow 4, we now have two new options. One of them you already saw a preview of, which is fan, which takes the original curvature of the selection into account and then extrapolates that outwards, which allows us to do some pretty cool things, like, for example, of course, fan things out like that, but also if we have more of a complex shape like so, we can just hold down Control, drag out from any one of these vertices, maybe that's a little bit too far, drag outwards, and add some thickness. The other option here is follow, which works a little bit differently. So if I were to, let's say, make a strip like this, and I wanted to curve this around an area, then I can hold down Control, draw a little curve like that. And instead of fan, let's set that to follow. And then all of the cuts in between are going to be rotated to follow my stroke. So for this one, to get the best results, usually if you're making a curve, you might want to start at one of the end vertices and just define the inner curve. That's going to work a little bit better. Let's set that to follow. You can see if you define the outer curve, then that doesn't work quite so well. But if you define the inner curve, that works great. This one is still pretty new. It was literally just added this morning, but it's already useful in a lot of situations. So this one is still a bit of a work in progress, but if you take the relax tool and just smooth this out, then you can get some great results. But we have a lot more things that we can do with strokes. And so I don't want to get too caught up on each individual feature because I want to show you all the main gestures. The next thing that you can do is bridge using that same idea. So if we create a stroke here, and let's say there's another strip of quads over here, then what I can do is just select one edge loop and draw from one vertex to the next. That's going to bridge everything in between. And if we do this with only a subset of these edges, let's say I only want to bridge these three, then I can hold down Control, drag from one vertex to the next. And if I want to change which one it's getting connected to, I can use this Shift Control here at the bottom. And the hotkey for that is Alt Scroll. So again, strokes is not just for creating new geometry, but also bridging existing geometry. If you'd like to fill in an area, then you can also make an L shape. For example, if I want to fill in this section here, then I could just define whatever the other corner is of this patch. So let's say I want to draw out from here, connect up there. Then I can create that L shape, and I can go from either direction. Alternatively, I could select some edges and define two more corners by drawing out a C shape. So let's say I want the patch to go up there. Then I can draw that out and it'll fill that in perfectly. So this just allows me to really fine tune exactly where the other corners of my patch are. And it's just another way to extrude things outwards. Lastly, we can also make loops, which is great for working with things like eyes and other circular shapes. And the way to do that is just by holding down Control and starting right where I ended. You can see as soon as that happens, then the little yellow circle over my cursor highlights to indicate that I'm snapping to something, and that'll create a full loop. Optionally, if you just create a stroke of edges and it doesn't quite connect, then you can also toggle cyclic here in the redo panel. Once you have a loop, then you can extrude it in a couple different ways. You could either draw a new loop on the inside or the outside. Oh, looks like that one didn't quite connect. Let's make sure the yellow circle is highlighted. Or again, just choose cyclic at the bottom. Or new in Retopoflow 4, you can also just extrude perpendicularly. So you can select a loop, draw inwards or outwards, and you can even make some crazy shapes if you want to, and everything will be interpolated as you'd expect. So as you can see, strokes is really, really versatile, but it will take a little bit of learning to just get used to the different shapes. But again, you can look at the documentation and all of these are described with pictures, so you can always refresh your memory at docs.retopoflow.com. Now I'll go ahead and delete all of these vertices, and let's take a look at contours. Contours is used for wrapping around objects, and it's perfect for usually cylindrical forms like legs and arms and fingers and things like that. And the way that you use it is you hold down Control, just like with the other tools, and drag across the surface of your object. In this case, I want to make sure that the center dot is placed right on the geometry that I want to wrap around. Then I let go, and now I have my new loop. Let's increase that a little bit more, which you can also do by holding down Control and scrolling up or down on the mouse wheel. Once you have a loop selected, then you can also extrude a new loop by creating another cut somewhere along the surface. And you can continue doing that. And you can also drag across existing loops to cut right in between. Contours has a couple different methods which are new in Retopoflow 4, but the default is set to walk, which is the same as it was in Retopoflow 3. But before we look at these other methods, I want to explain a little bit about how walk works. And I want you to notice that it works really great even when things are overlapping in screen space. So for example, let's say I want to create a loop around this back leg here. Even if that's partially occluded by the mesh, as long as I make sure that that center dot is over the back leg, then it can still wrap around it perfectly, as you can see there. So I can use this even when things are occluded, and the reason it works is because it walks around every single face it encounters until it gets back to the start. As you can imagine, this is incredibly accurate, but when it comes to super high poly meshes, it's not always the fastest, and also it doesn't work with non-manifold objects. So to look at an example of that, let's check out Suzanne. I'll hit Shift-A, add a monkey, give her some subdivision surface with Control-3, and then just Shift-A, Mesh, and Retopology at Cursor. Then I'll go down to Contours, and you can see that if I create a stroke over her eye, just like this, it won't wrap around her entire head, but instead just the eye. You can see it conforms to the surface perfectly fine, but since this is not a manifold shape, the eye is separated from the rest of the head, it's not going to wrap around the rest of the head. These other processing methods, though, work a little bit differently. First, let's take a look at fast. And this one is labeled as experimental, and so is the other one because they're still works in progress and are not guaranteed to work all of the time. So use these with caution. But this method also uses the two dots that you see on the outside and not just the center dot when you draw a stroke. And so if I do that with Suzanne here and use the center dot over the eye and the outer dots over the rest of the head, then I can actually wrap a loop all the way around, even though that's not manifold geometry. Now let's go back to our bear cub here. I'll hit Tab to go into edit mode just to continue this existing retopology. And if I were to use fast, let's say over a really big area, let's say like here, you'll notice that that was pretty instant. So unlike with walk, it doesn't calculate every single face, and so I can use this one incredibly quickly. It's just going to be a little bit more picky about where those points are placed. So for example, if I wanted to wrap around this leg, I'd want to make sure that all three of those points are within the leg, and that will work fine. But if I create a big stroke like this and include some of the other geometry on those points, then we'll get a little bit more of a mess. So it's a bit more finicky and you have to be more careful about where you're placing this, but it's much, much, much faster. Also, skip is another method that is significantly faster as well and is a little bit more accurate, kind of like walk, but it doesn't calculate every single face, and so it can also be a great method. So give those a try if you'd like, but again, those are still works in progress and are not guaranteed to work all of the time. So I would recommend sticking with walk for now if you want things to be completely stable. And with that, we've covered all of the tools in Retopoflow 4 beta. There's also a hotkey for switching between them, which you can get by hitting W while you're in any of the Retopoflow tools. So I can switch really quickly between any of the tools like so. And here you'll also see that we have patches, which is grayed out, which is a tool that we had in Retopoflow 3 that hasn't yet been ported over to Retopoflow 4. So that one's still on the way. We just wanted to make sure all of the other tools were solid first. Now, just to wrap things up, let me go through all of the other menus that we have here at the top, because we have some that are common in all of the tools. And let me just make some geometry so we actually have something to look at here. But under the tweaking menu, here we can enable or disable auto merge. This is just a mirror of Blender's setting and is just a convenient place for it. But then you can also adjust your preferences for the selection distance and whether or not things are auto-selected when you use the mouse tweak versus the keyboard tweak. So for example, if I just left click and drag, it's going to select and tweak whatever is under the mouse. But if I hit G to grab, then it doesn't really matter what I'm hovered over, it'll just grab the selection. But you could change this if you want, so that if you hit G, you can tweak, and some people like this so that it reduces the number of clicks that you have to do. but that's not really consistent with what Blender does, so that's usually off. Next up, we have some cleanup options. And this one's specifically useful for when you do operations that aren't really supported by snapping in Blender by default. So let's say we have a really flat area here. Let me go ahead and delete these edge loops. And let's say I want to put in a new edge loop with Control R. Well, I can do that, but if I move that, Control R and then move, that's going to snap to the surface. But if I hit Control R, there are some situations where it's not going to snap. In that case, it looked... nope, see, there we go. If I hit Escape right after creating the loops, then it's not going to snap. What you can do is just go ahead and click the play button next to clean up, and that will snap everything to the surface. It'll also do a few other just general cleanup things like merging by distance, recalculating normals, deleting loose geometry, and filling holes. If you want this to work a bit faster, then you can of course turn all of these things off if you'd like, if you have, really dense geometry that you're working with. But by default, it's just going to automatically fix all of the common issues that people run into in retopology. You can also get this in the W hotkey pie menu. So let's say I have some vertices here, and I bevel, which is another command that's not supported by snapping in Blender. Then I can hit W and clean up either selected or all. So do that and everything will get cleaned up. Next to the cleanup options, we have some general options. And here's where we can change the retopology overlay. And by default, the 0.2 meters is really, really big. That's just Blender's default. So usually something like 0.05 is going to be a lot better. And you can see that that's no longer poking through the mesh as I rotate around. And you can also change the color here. This is just going to reach in and change your theme. So by default, yours might look a little bit different than mine, depending on your theme, but you can change this color to whatever you'd like. You can also choose to fade sources or not, or fade all of the objects in the background. It is the same as the fade inactive geometry in Blender's overlays. And you can also choose to collapse the tools into one single group of tools, or collapse or expand the masking options in the brush tools in case that's taking up too much space. Lastly, at the top, we have exclude non-selectable, which is just referencing Blender's option of the same name in the snapping settings, exclude non-selectable. And that just means if you have the selection toggle on under restriction toggles, let's say we have a bunch of these bears, and let's also just make a whole bunch of these just to show how much more performant Retopoflow 4 is than Retopoflow 3. Let's say we have quite a lot of bears. What are we at? Let's go to faces, 22 million. Let's do a few more. Okay, somewhere around 30 million. If I go to my retopology here, and let's say I'm using strokes, then I can draw across all of these different objects, and it'll snap to them just fine. And things are very, very snappy in Retopoflow 4. So performance is really not an issue here. But let's say that I wanted to just make sure that all of these are not things that I can snap to. Well, then I can take the selection toggle and turn them off. And so now if I make a stroke, of course I have to actually have that option on, exclude non-selectable, and now I can't draw across them. So if you want to have objects in your scene that are visible but can't be snapped to, then go ahead and use exclude non-selectable. Now I think I've covered everything, but just in case, if you have any questions about the tools, you can go ahead and read the documentation. You can also ask questions on the thread on Blender Artists. You can report an issue on GitHub. And of course, if you want to purchase Retopoflow 4 while it's in beta, then you can do that on Superhive, formerly the Blender Market. I'm so excited to have this out here because it's been several years that we've been working towards this, and it's only because of your support that we've been able to keep up support for Retopoflow 3 while also working on this in the background. So it's been a really long time in the making, and it's been a huge passion project for us, so I really hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, subscribe for more updates, and I'll see you in the next one.